All right, we are live. Hello and welcome to everyone. I am today joined by Tom Quiggin, who is the co-author of the book Submission, The Danger of Political Islam to Canada with a Warning to America. He is also the primary contributor to the Quiggin Report, which is a podcast on free speech and security issues. So I'm very happy to have him on the show today. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Cheers. Thanks very much for inviting me, Sham.
All right, fantastic. So lots to get through today. So let's kind of start at the beginning because we're talking today about political Islam and the rise of political Islam in Canada and the problems it can pose. So Canada has obviously had a Muslim population for a while, but when do you think that this whole issue of political Islam, which is so abrasive to Canadian democracy, started?
The issue in Canada and the United States, by the way, it runs pretty much parallel. There was just the first glimmerings of it in the 50s and into the 1960s, especially when a lot of folks started being driven out of Egypt by a series of coups and upsets and problems there. And of course, much of the Middle East had the same problem. Where it really gets going is in the late 1980s. A number of Muslim Brotherhood front groups, which had been formed in America and Canada, decided to go from being below ground to being above ground. So they started forming things like the Muslim Student Association, which was their first ever above ground effort. And that succeeded reasonably well in a number of American and Canadian universities. And then based on the strengths of that, they created something called ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, which again was an above ground front group for the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been quite successful. So that's sort of in North America, that's when that whole thing starts. Where it gets really rocking in terms of money and numbers is probably the early 90s, and then it's been a straightforward growth program since then.
Right. And how do you think it's manifested itself in Canadian society? Is it more sort of prevalent in government? And is it something that you see become part of sort of the broader Canadian society as well?
I see, you can see it manifesting itself in Canada, America, and I've traveled quite a bit in Western Europe as well, the Netherlands, France, the United Kingdom, etc. And you can see it manifesting itself there in a number of ways. Part of it here in Canada, for instance, you see it in government. So we have this M103 anti-Islamophobia motion, which has got a large amount of support from the Liberal government, not to mention funding. And what it is at the end of the day is it's an attempt to impose Pakistani-style blasphemy laws in Canada. And I'm not picking on Pakistan there too much. But the person behind all this is Iqra Khalid, her father Hafiz Khalid. They're both from Pakistan. They're both very strong adherents to the sort of Jam Islamiyah kind of ideology and growth system. And they both have very strong ties back to ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. So we get this sort of M103 motion, which is supposed to be, it's about anti-hate, but it has to focus on just Islamophobia. And a number of people said, hey.
I believe that it says, it's condemning Islamophobia and other types of hate. That's what it says, right?
Yes, so that's what got people, and they say, why does it have to focus on Islamophobia? And it's like, well, we're special. We need special treatment. And the answer here in Canada is the folks who get in trouble, the folks who are suffering because of this kind of thing, typically are blacks, gays, and Jews. They suffer the brunt of most of what you might call racist-orientated crime. South Asians, a little further down the scale, but Muslims in particular, especially in the last couple of years, despite all the hype, they're actually falling down the scale of suffering direct abuse, i.e. people beating them up on the street, this kind of stuff. It's actually going down. So if it's blacks, gays, and Jews that are suffering the worst of racism, why do we need a special class of protection for Muslims? And the answer is Islamophobia is intended not to stop hate crime or dissent against Muslims. It's designed to stop the criticism of political Islam. That's why Islamophobia exists. Same in Canada, same in America, same in Sweden, Norway.
Because if you think about it, Tom, like isn't like hate, speaking out against hate or acting against hate, that's part of the Constitution anyway. That's part of the law. Why do we need this special motion to come out that basically regurgitates what's already part of the law?
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. The Canadian Constitution and then the Canadian Charter of Rights, a much newer document, are very clear on discriminating against anyone based on gender, class, orientation, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's no actual requirement for it. The problem is and this is what the political Islam has. The problem they have is they cannot rationally discuss their ideology and their policy in public, because if they did, everybody would jump all over them and go, hang on just a second, you can't beat your wife because she's not following the Quran properly. You can't force your wife to stay in her home unless you give her permission to leave. You cannot go around chucking gay people off the roof, and no, we can't stone girls who are unwed.
Right.
So you've got things like the Islamic Circle of North America. The books they actually hand out to people say the treatment for an unwed woman is to allow the baby to be born because the baby is innocent, and then stone the mother. It's kind of like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that.
There was this crazy thing that I saw. There was some Pew report, I believe, that was done, and this is something I believe Sam Harris was talking about on his podcast, where he was talking to the Pew people went to talk to Muslims in Britain, and they were talking to them about what should be the punishment for apostasy, and 100% of the people, nearly 100% of the people, said death. Yeah. And that's that's Muslims living in a Western democratic country.
Yeah, if you back that up a bit, the Pew report did actually a global thing. And in some Muslim majority countries and some Muslim majority areas, they got, responses to that question were stunningly high. Yeah. If you look at things like the United Kingdom, Canada, America, Belgium, France, etc., if you look at an older Muslim population, people that immigrated to the United Kingdom 50, 100 years ago or whatever, they're less wrapped around the axle about this stuff. And they've been there longer. But they also separated themselves from the old countries and the old ways. Now you've got the young who are being affected by a whole series of youth movements and a whole series of front groups. And the belief that you can kill people for apostasy is quite high. Some of them are saying, well, so we had a guy here in Canada, Aaron Driver. He's our first attempted suicide bomber. He tried to set off his suicide bomb in London, Ontario, but the police caught him literally in the driveway as he's getting in the taxi to go off and do it. But he'd actually said he thinks you should be able to kill non-Muslims. And then he kind of goes, but you have to be in a Muslim majority country first.
Okay. Kind of like, well, thanks for that.
I'm glad you qualified that by saying here in Canada, we can't kill non-Muslims, but once we get a Muslim majority, then we can. Same thing with Jaish-e-Mohammed. You mentioned Kashmir a while back. Yes. In your discussions, the whole point, Jaish-e-Mohammed is actually clear on this. It's not like they're shy. They print this stuff. They talk about it. They say the purpose of Kashmir for them is they want to liberate Kashmir, make it into a Muslim majority nation, and then use that as the springboard to remove the rest of the non-Muslims from India.
Yes.
Not just like the next state over or, whatever. It's like the ambitions are very high. So when you look at the founder, for instance, of Jamaat Islamiyah, al-Maududi, he says, the intent of Islam is to destroy all other forms of belief in all other countries. And same with Hassan al-Banna, the guy that founded the Muslim Brotherhood. He was very clear on it, that what they want to do is have Islam dominate all other forms of belief. And by Islam here, I mean political Islam.
Sure. And let me give you an example to that end from Kashmir as well. Like the idea that is sold to the public about Kashmir is that, Kashmir is about liberation and Kashmir is about rights. If Kashmir is about rights and Kashmir is about liberation, then what was the need to ethnically cleanse the Hindus from Kashmir? I mean, the Hindus of Kashmir are Kashmiri too. If you want liberation, then you should have liberation for them too. What's the need to ethnically cleanse people?
Yeah, it's very clear that groups like Jamaat Islamiyah and the Muslim Brotherhood, who probably the two of the largest Sunni political Islam organizations, are very clear on this. Hassan al-Banna, I might just read this quote to you. This is a classic from him. Hassan al-Banna says, "It is the nature of Islam to dominate, not to be dominated. It is the nature of Islam to impose its law on all nations and extend its power to the entire planet."
Right.
So there's kind of like, in their little world, it's kind of binary. It's us and nobody else. So there is no accommodation. There is no saying, well, okay, I'm going to sit here and be a Hindu and I'll be a quiet little Hindu.
Right.
No. Once we get going, you're under the thumb or you're gone. Simple as that. And this is part of the problem. And this is where we're trying to alert people to something. It says, if you have people whose belief system is political Islam, not religious Islam, not whatever, but political Islam as defined by the Muslim Brotherhood, as defined by Jamaat Islamiyah, Hizb ut-Tahrir, etc., you will ultimately wind up with civil conflict.
Right.
Because they say they have the right to move to your country, establish their belief system, and then force you to live by their belief system because they believe their belief system outranks yours. So in America, for instance, I mean, you've got the Constitution, same thing here in Canada. Some of these newly elected congressional representatives, somebody should ask them a point blank question. Which holds primacy in your mind, the Constitution or the Koran?
Right.
So Muslim Brotherhood, they actually say the Koran is our Constitution. In other words, their belief in their interpretation of Sharia law, their belief in their interpretation of the Koran outranks the American Constitution, outranks the Bill of Rights, outranks the Canadian Constitution. And I think that is particularly dangerous because you can't have two groups of people existing in a country where they have two entirely different opposing belief systems. So ultimately, you're going to wind up with physical violence. So people ask sort of the question, what's going on? Like, why is it we've got, ISIS? Why do we have bombs going off in France? Why do we have some crazy guy with a gun running into the Canadian Parliament trying to shoot the place up? Why do we have, truck attacks in the Berlin market? Why do we have bombs going off or whatever in Sweden or whatever? And the answer is you have a group of people who believe they have the right to dominate all others based on their interpretation of their God. A certain minority of those think that violence is a way to make that happen. So when people say, well, it's got nothing to do with Islam and it doesn't represent pure Islam and it doesn't represent true Islam, it's like, no, it doesn't, but it represents political Islam.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
And the thing is that political ideology is tied so deeply within the culture as well, because you have these madrasas, these Islamic schools that are popping up all over the world that a lot of these people are sending their children to, and they're being taught there explicitly that you are not part of this society, you're part of this other society, and your goal is to eventually dominate, which is crazy. Because if you look at India, what's really, really worrying is that in the last 5 or 6 years, the number of these Saudi-funded madrasas has gone up from around 500,000 to over 1 million. And that's just within like a 5-year period. So, and what these kids are learning, everybody knows what kids are being taught in madrasas. There's plenty of videos out there on YouTube which you can see. So it's when people are saying that, oh, this doesn't represent the people, this doesn't represent this and that, and to some extent that may be true, but I don't think that in Europe, then in Canada, in India, that those things particularly hold true.
It's not so much a matter of where we are, it's where we're going.
Yeah.
And the answer is, if you'd done surveys on this kind of stuff 20, 30, 40 years ago, the number of people who would say death for apostates in Canada or America or Sweden would have been extremely low. I don't know how low, but very low.
Yeah.
For instance, in 2006 in Canada, we had something called the Toronto 18 plot. A bunch of young guys inspired by radical Islam wanted to get 5,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and detonate either the CN Tower or the CBC building or something like that, or the CSIS building. The thing got stopped before it got too far. But they did a survey afterwards, about a year later, and said, if those young fellas had set off their 5,000-pound bomb, would it have been justified? 12% of Canadian Muslims said yes.
Wow.
Well, it's only 12%, but that works out.
It's a high enough number.
That works out to about 120,000 people. It's like, oh my God. And that was in 2006. So what you've seen is, in fact, the school system, these separate schools where this stuff is literally being preached to them, and I use that term in the correct sense of its use, is getting to be a real issue. So we just had there's a guy in jail right now in New York State, a young fella from Mississauga, Canada, was in New York State, brought some explosive material down with him. He and a couple of his buddies wanted to blow up either a subway stop in New York City or to hit Times Square itself. Interestingly enough, as part of his defense, they try to say, well, he's misguided youth. He was led down the wrong path. The usual kind of gang. Right. Why is little Billy Bob in a gang holding up a store? Well, it's the influence of bad people around him, and he's not really a bad guy. So anyway, what's fascinating, this kid actually writes, and he writes this in a statement which showed up in court and said his parents were concerned about him, so they decided they were going to send him back to Kuwait to go to school there. And he said, I don't want to go to school in Kuwait. So they said, good, we'll send you to a good Islamic school here in Mississauga. And he goes, it was the school that sent me down the path to radicalization. Wow. It was the school that taught me Islam must dominate. And you just kind of go, wow, here we go. Everybody's complained about radicalization. They blame it on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, which there's some truth to.
Sure.
The reality is we've had terrorism for well in excess of 3,000 years, so it's not YouTube's fault. The reality is the kid actually says, yeah, I never got this whole crazy Islam thing into my head until I went to an Islamic school in Mississauga, which is essentially Toronto. So, I mean, yeah, this is what's being taught in the schools. And by the way, the school he went to is the same one a couple of Toronto 18 kids went to, but we won't get into that. But
wow.
This is the kind of stuff that's going on. So you see a lot of governments right now. The European Union is really trying to crack down on the tech companies. Prime Minister May is blaming online videos for radicalization and whatever. But like I just mentioned, terrorism has been around for a long time, far predates technology, or at least technology of this kind. And the influence, the treadmills that put these kids on the path, or whatever you want to call it, a lot of the times it's the student associations, the cultural groups, the schools. That's where the groundwork is being done to shape children's mind. We have a guy here in Canada, for instance, has a series of videos out. He's very clear that your job is to not integrate. He actually says that word for word. Your job is to not integrate. Your job is to prepare for the arrival of Islam. Now, this guy's a Shia guy, so it's tied up in a certain degree of, Ali and the returning prophet and all that stuff. But nonetheless, we have a whole bunch of these imams right across Canada who are teaching, your job is to not integrate.
That's incredible. What's the reaction of people, the general population in Canada, when they see something like that? Because, I mean, that's a pretty major indictment of a person or of a community when you have the community or people within a community following leaders like this who are explicitly calling on them to not integrate to the society that they've moved to and a country that has been, welcoming enough to give them a space.
Well, it's interesting. The mainstream press here in Canada is so completely submissive and so well trained, they won't touch any of these issues. And if they do, they immediately address it in terms of racism, that racists are complaining about this. So everything is put in sort of an alt-right, racist, neo-Nazi, whatever. Literally, you're a neo-Nazi if you raise these issues. So I think that's kind of the official view in public. If you go below that, if you go into things like Twitter and Gab and Facebook, whatever, you're seeing a lot of people saying, hey, what the heck? My grandparents came here, my parents came here, and they were told, get a job, get going, this is what we're doing. But now we have people who show up here and say the exact opposite. So there was a video floating around here for a while. It got banned off YouTube, but whatever. It's still out there floating around. It was a council meeting in, I think it was Brampton or Mississauga. I'm pretty sure it was Mississauga. A group of community Muslims showed up at the council meeting demanding special privileges for their kids in public taxpayer schools. They want Friday prayers in public taxpayer-funded schools.
Wow.
Here's the interesting bit, and this is what got everybody angry, is the city council meeting always starts with the playing of O Canada and then on with the business. They refuse to stand for O Canada because, to them, that would put the government above their religious beliefs. So they protest and said, we won't stand for it. When people challenged them that, they said, too bad, that's the way we think. Now, they then immediately turn around and want special privileges for their children in school. They want Friday prayers in school, even though we're not allowed to have Christmas plays anymore. And needless to say, they got it. Most high schools in Mississauga now, public taxpayer-funded schools, have Friday prayers written by folks who are associated to most of the Muslim Brotherhood front groups.
Wow,
but
really?
Very little happened. But privately, that went right all across the country, and people like, hang on just a second. You won't stand for O Canada, you won't respect law, but you want special privileges in public schools, not even your own privately funded schools. Yeah, that kind of thing, I think, is below the screen. So I've had a lot of people ask me, how could Donald Trump possibly get elected? And the
Why do you think?
Yeah, a lot of people are thinking stuff that's not being reported in the media. I, for one, when Trump was, going through the electoral process, I kind of figured he was 50-50. He stood a chance, only because I've traveled in America quite a bit, and I've gone down back roads, small towns, poor areas, and I see how angry people are. So, the same question must arise. What do people think about it? Well, our national media says, oh, Canada's wonderful, multiculturalism. We're all about diversity, and isn't this lovely? Everybody loves it. And the answer is, not if you go 10 kilometers outside of Ottawa in any direction. You find there's a lot of really angry people. And this is one of my fears, actually, is when things go wrong, we tend to blame the other. So there's Pearl Harbor. So people have been warning for years about the Japanese. They did nothing. Pearl Harbor gets pumped. What do? We go from nothing to total overreaction. We put the whole bunch of them in concentration camps.
Yeah.
Shred of evidence. And you go, oh, like, I get what they were thinking. I know there was a war on, but it was just the wrong response. So hopefully you'd say, well, we're smarter now.
Yeah.
But the answer is we are allowing all kinds of stuff to go on and not doing anything. But if you look at the government of France, their senior intelligence officials are warning about a civil war in France based on their inability to deal with the issue of radical Islam and no-go zones. So when you have like the minister from Macron quit the government, said, I'm done, I can't deal with this problem, nobody wants to deal with it, so I won't do it.
Wow.
The former head of France's internal intelligence agency, so think the FBI, but with a stronger intelligence function, actually testified to the French Parliament and said, yeah, a couple more terrorist attacks like the attack on the nightclub and the road attack, the truck attack, he says, we'll have civil war in France. So he was challenged on this later by the media, and they say, did you actually say that? And he said, yep, I said it. Now, in any other country, he'd have been fired immediately. If the head of the FBI said there's going to be a civil war based on whatever, he'd probably be fired for saying that. Here in Canada, if the head of our CISA spoke out on saying something like that, he'd be fired for basically confronting the government and saying the government's failing. And in France, normally they fire them in a heartbeat. That guy they didn't fire because they didn't dare.
Yeah.
Things are that bad. So, yeah, that's the kind of direction we're headed. And I think the same thing in Canada, America. We're not dealing with the problem now. So what we'll probably do is we'll overreact later, which will be even worse.
It is. And I want to talk a little bit about the Trudeau government and sort of diversity, because, people are very keen on the word diversity. And, I like diversity too. Diversity is a good thing, but diversity is only a good thing if you're operating under equal circumstances for everyone. If one group of people have different rules than other group of people, then that's not true diversity. Diversity will only thrive if everybody operates under the same rules and the same circumstances. Well, that's just my personal opinion.
No, I think you're right. I mean, this term diversity, which has become a religious cult belief in the last years, didn't exist 10 years ago in political discourse. The terms we used were integration.
Yes.
And then we kind of drifted towards multiculturalism. Oh, you can come here, you don't have to integrate, you can keep your culture without integrating. But even in multiculturalism, there was kind of a working idea in there somewhere that we may have several different cultures, but we all play by the same.
And I also think that you can genuinely integrate while keeping your culture as well. Unless your culture is one that is just completely antithetical to democratic values, I think you can keep your culture and integrate. It's not such a hard thing to do.
Yeah, so here we have the problem. Now we're being told diversity means we have to accept their culture.
Right.
Like, no, we don't. I'm sorry if a bunch of guys from somewhere in the South Pacific want to move to Canada and they're headhunters, it's like, sorry, your culture might be good there. The answer is no, it's not good here. There are still societies that have cannibalism, and we've come to a general conclusion in the West, we're not going down that road. So we're not accepting it. But yet somehow, if somebody has an identifiable culture like political Islam or like a number of other extremist movements, oh, well, we have to accommodate their beliefs. And of course, this is, at the end of the day, this is postmodernism at its worst, where we get this thing, well, first off, you have to understand all cultures are equal. And if you say a culture is not equal to yours, it's because you're racist. And if I look at it and say, well, I'm sorry, your culture sexually mutilates 4-year-old girls,
right,
rapes women, throws gay people off the roof, etc., and I say, no, I think your culture sucks. Well, apparently I'm the racist.
Right.
And I'm like, wow, how did that get to be?
Right. I'm not the one doing it. I'm just saying, I'm just talking about it, and I become the racist.
Yeah, so all of what we called progress, India is a different case because it's got like a 5,000-year history. Europe's history is really only, the last 2,500 years or whatever. Of course, North American history, depending you look at Inca civilizations, whatever, but certainly the modern day history of Canada and America are newer. There's less history involved there. But we kind of broke away. I mean, a lot of the folks that came to North America broke away from Europe because Europe was teaching the ideas of education, freedom, separation of church and state. Some people actually believed it and kind of moved over here and started it. So these societies, Europe and to a certain part North America, have given us the idea of equality, the idea that the individual has value, that the state just can't kill individuals because they get bored of looking at them, that people have agency, that women have rights, that there should be some rough idea of equivalency before the law. We all know rich people get away with more than poor people, but nonetheless, the working premise is we have rule of law rather than rule of power. And we have, history and philosophy behind us that says if you go to a anarchical kind of system, it becomes nasty, brutal, and short, as it was put. So over the last 500 years, we've developed this idea of let's get rid of slavery. So that actually is a European idea. Freedom of speech, all this sort of stuff comes out and it spreads around the world. And now we're kind of moving that direction. But all of a sudden under postmodernism, we're told, well, that's all bad. You think you're superior because of all that, and you're not. And in fact, we have to accommodate other cultures and bring them in. So we look at these folks with their, 6th century Arabian values, and they come in and they say they want us to run our country to accommodate them. And the answer should be, no, I'm sorry. If you want to move in 6th century Arabia, well, Saudi Arabia. And even the Saudi government is starting to cut these guys off. But anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, how many people did Saudi Arabia take from Iraq and Syria when the Great Migration was happening? Barely anyone.
Actually, there's a fascinating story. It's interesting you brought this up. The last time the Syrians had a real good go at the Muslim Brotherhood was back, I'd have to go back, I think it was 1982, 1984, something like that. Assad Sr., the father of the guy now, got into a headbanging competition with the Muslim Brotherhood and just told them, you're leaving. So he took heavy artillery to the city of Homs, and literally they grid squared the place, a military term. They just divided into grid squares and then took the town down with heavy artillery.
Wow.
Killed, no one quite knows, 100, 150,000 people died in the artillery strikes, and anybody who was Muslim Brotherhood was told, leave.
Wow.
A bunch of them did in order to save their lives, and a bunch of them wound up in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. This time around, the Saudis were told, oh, we've got all these Muslim Brotherhood guys. They went, sorry, got to get our hair done Friday. We're busy. I can't talk to you. The answer is no. And I read a thing somewhere that said, I think it was in 2008 or 2010, the Saudis took 12. Not 12,000, not 1,200, but 12.
12, yeah. The Saudis take 12, and guess how many Germany takes? Yeah, I think it's incredible.
Yeah, the point of that was the Saudis learned their lesson last time around. We don't want take your Muslim Brotherhood stuff and go down the road.
Yeah, true. So let's talk about the Trudeau government, because I feel like a lot of people, particularly at least outside of Canada, have been hearing about political Islam and the sort of growing influence of political Islam within Canadian government and Canadian society more after the election of Justin Trudeau. And there's a feeling among some people that the Trudeau government is a lot more lax with tolerating ideas of political Islam and tolerating ideas of the sort of Khalistani movement within its government, and it doesn't do enough to be able to tackle those issues effectively. And they point towards, M103 as one of the symptoms of that. And how much truth do you see in that?
That book I just wrote, which I should note I co-wrote with largely Muslim co-authors.
Yes.
One of the things we actually tackle is exactly this, the issue of Mr. Trudeau. When I first started writing that book, I had no intention of putting his name in the book.
Right.
But as we did more and more research on it, his name just pops up. You can't get away from it. So what I actually came to conclusion after about 3 years of nonstop research behind this kind of thing is, whatever Justin Trudeau did when he was young, let's forget that. Let's look at when he enters public life. So he becomes a member of Parliament in 2008. So my view is, once you're a member of Parliament, you're on the public record, you're fair game. So from 2008 to 2018, when that book came out, that's 10 years. In that 10-year period, every time the issue of radical Islam, extremism, terrorism, or whatever came up, Justin Trudeau, always took the side of political Islam, took the side of the terrorists, took the side of whomever, and worked against the general interests of Canadians. And I was kind of shocked by that, and I actually kind of doubled down and said, well, it can't be right. There's got to be some other examples. Right. And the answer is no. So, for instance, he gave an interview to Al Mashreq, which is a Hezbollah newspaper in Montreal, and said, when I'm elected prime minister, I'll have a special program for Muslims and Arabs. And,
wow.
Sure he did. So everybody was shocked when we started bringing in, was it 40 or 50,000 Syrians, and I wasn't, because He said he was going to do it. The mosque he went to in
Did people react to that back when he said it? How did people react to that?
Very few people noticed it. The mainstream media mentioned it, of course, because that's Islamophobic to report that kind of thing. And you're racist if you do, by the way. So there you go. But yeah, so it's interesting that that never got much coverage, but nonetheless, there it is. So he went to a mosque in Montreal to say, you know, the Liberal Party's great, vote for me, all that kind of stuff. And folks said, you know, was that a good choice of mosque to go to? Because that mosque was identified by the CIA as one of the top 7 mosques in the world for recruiting Al-Qaeda people. Not only that, there was a Canadian broadcast outfit back in about 208 or 209 or something like that, put an undercover guy in there, and the undercover guy is Algerian, came out and he said, like, holy crap, you should see what they're doing in there. It's death to the Jews, death to Israel, death to America, all that kind of stuff.
Wow.
We need to weaponize the youth so they become the ammunition of our society, all this kind of stuff. So they put this to Trudeau and said, you know, do you think that's the right place to go? And he goes, well, as Canadians, we have to make our own decisions. We have to think about these problems. And I don't think the Americans got it right in this case. And so it was just like, wow, you went there and you didn't think anything was wrong. He also once personally went to Reviving the Islamic Spirit, which is a big conference. It's held in Toronto every year. It was started by a bunch of well-meaning Muslim youth after 9/11 who kind of said, look, you know, Muslim equals terrorist now in people's minds.
Yeah.
And want to kind of revive the spirit and say, you know, that ain't us. Not all of us want to do that. We want to get away from it. It became reasonably successful. Then it was basically taken over. So now it's like a who's who of the Muslim Brotherhood front groups in North America. And guys like Tariq Ramadan speak there. Well, he's in jail, but whatever. But it was kind of a who's who of radical Islam. Trudeau went to this thing once, and then once he was elected prime minister, he sent a video and said, we share your belief, we share your future, we share your values. And people are kind of like, wow, what values is it you share?
Yeah.
So anyway, all of this to say there's a 10-year pattern where he supports the Islamists in every case, one exception. And we think this was American pressure. All of a sudden last year, he popped up in Parliament and supported an opposition movement to list the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist group, and he voted yes for it. And everybody just kind of like, wow, an opposition movement or an opposition motion that ran against his interest in supporting Iran, but nonetheless, he told his party to vote for it. Now, having said that, they haven't been listed as a terrorist group yet, and there's no sign he's going to. So one exception where he actually spoke against radical Islam, nothing happened. Now, more interesting enough is his brother, Alexandra, Sasha. This guy used to work for Press TV, which is the Iranian government propaganda TV channel. And he did a couple of documentaries like the mullahs are a bunch of great guys. Iran needs a nuclear program for defense and all this kind of stuff.
Wow.
He did another program. I think they're looking at like Palestinian Islamic Jihad or one of those outfits and saying, what a great bunch of freedom fighters these guys are. And they're really like modern day Robin Hoods is how we should think about it. So this is the prime minister's own brother is on the public record as supporting the government of Iran and the mullahs who run arguably like the worst government on earth, possible exception of North Korea. So, I mean, so when people say, wow, you know, is Canada really a little soft on terrorism? It's not that he's soft on terrorism. It's that he stood up in Parliament and said, if you oppose the return of ISIS fighters to Canada, it's because you're Islamophobic.
That's incredible.
And it kind of like, well, okay, it's got something to do with Islam, apparently. But if I oppose ISIS fighters coming back to Canada, it's not because I'm ex-military. It's not that I've been to a civil war like that, like I saw in Bosnia. It's not that I understand what genocide and mass killing is about. The reason I'm opposed to apparently is because I'm Islamophobic.
Right.
He also said that he wants ISIS fighters to return to Canada because there'll be a powerful voice for de-radicalization. The only problem, of course, is we don't have a de-radicalization program here in Canada. There hasn't been really a successful de-radicalization program run anywhere in the world except for Singapore, kind of maybe. And the reality is most de-radicalization programs are based on a false assumption that it's ideology that's driving the problem.
No, and the other thing is also that people are assuming that these people that are coming back have been de-radicalized. That's a major assumption that you're making, which may or may not be true at all. Yeah. Maybe it's just a case of, oh, you know, these ISIS fighters are like, all right, ISIS is gone. This river's run dry. Let's go back home and try and find something.
Yeah, there's sort of a working assumption that, oh, they were kind of misguided youth. They were off on a great adventure. They're going to go have a year and yell, Allahu Akbar.
Yeah, it's like spring break.
Yeah. Unfortunately, when you look at it, because a lot of them say, well, they were misguided. They thought they were going to a new Islamic caliphate that was going to be full of wonder and happiness. And it's like, well, the recruiting film showed pilots in cages having gasoline dumped on them and being burned alive. The recruiting films had a bunch of Coptic folks lined up on a beach with their heads being cut off. So the idea that somehow this was misguided youth thinking they were going to go to Shangri-La in order to live in a city up on the hill somewhere, it's absolute nonsense. The recruiting films were the most horrendous violence that we've seen in this century so far. So that's kind of the first problem. The second problem is there's a working assumption that it's ideology. Well, they were really good kids, and then they watched a thing on YouTube, and then they went crazy. So we'll go to other videos, and then they'll go uncrazy, and then they'll be fine. And it's like, yeah, for folks like me that have been doing terrorism stuff for a lot of years, like well before 9/11, well before all this sort of stuff, the reality is there's a whole lot of people out there that are angry at political systems. The Front de Libération in Quebec, the Khalistani movement in India, all around the world, the Corsicans, Rwanda, you name it. There's always some group that's angry at the status quo for whatever reason. But the question is, why do you have a bunch of angry people here, but this one decides to go blow stuff up? And that's, of course, the $64 billion question. Why do you have a group of 100 people who are angry, but this one wants to blow things up, and that causes the actual problem? And the answer, it has a lot more to do with the politics of identity, how they view themselves within the community, how they view their own community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not necessarily the ideology that drives them, quote unquote, crazy. So when you have people going around, basically like sociologists in university, who I won't get into what I'd like to do to them, but they're all going about, oh, it's de-radicalization. It's the ideology we need to address. We can reprogram them with a different ideology and show them the errors of their way. And it's like, that's like a guy having a heart attack. So you give him chemotherapy. It's like, chemotherapy, good for cancer, electronic shock, good for the heart attack. But so if you apply the wrong medicine to the wrong problem, you kill the patient, or the patient just gets even sicker. Yeah. So this whole idea that we can de-radicalize people away from terrorism is based on a series of false assumptions. Why don't we have de-radicalization programs for bank robbers and rapists and wife beaters and tax fraud people? Right. Why don't we do that? And the answer is, well, no one's ever, it's been thought about, but the reality is it won't work. The reason we talk about de-radicalization is that's the one thing we can talk about in public to address the issue of political extremism in America, in Canada, and elsewhere. Because if I stood up in public in most cases and said, I think that community center over there is run by a guy who's an adherent of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he's creating a social, cultural, and political space where discussing violence is acceptable, and I think we should take that guy's money away. Oh my God, you're Islamophobic, you're racist, whatever. But if I stand up and say, well, we need a de-radicalization program, then everybody's on board with that, and you can discuss that. So that's one of the reasons de-radicalization is out there. You never heard of a de-radicalization program for the Irish Republican Army?
Yeah.
I mean, they just sent a few bombs to London last week, and it's been going on for a couple hundred years. Why don't we have a de-radicalization program for the IRA?
Right.
Well, there's reasons for it.
Exactly. And I think it does this kind of talk and this kind of a narrative does a disservice to the Muslim community in general as well, because what it is promoting, it is essentially promoting a kind of ghettoization of the Muslim community. You're saying that the Muslim community in Canada, the Muslim community in America and the West, wherever they are, they do not need to abide by the rules and laws of those societies. Now, the societies where the Muslims move to, they must do whatever they can to make the Muslims feel welcome in terms of celebrating their festivals. There was this insipid march in Washington somewhere where there were women that were wearing hijabs that were made out of the American flag, which I thought was the silliest thing I've ever seen. And so you have to do that. You have to, bend over backwards to try and make sure that the Muslims feel welcome. You have to go and celebrate Eid. You have to go and celebrate Ramadan and all of that stuff. But you cannot ask the Muslims to participate in your cultural festivals, because that would be racist, because that would be not welcoming. And you're essentially, I know you're coming from a good place, but at the end of the day, you're inadvertently promoting a weird kind of ghettoization of the Muslim community within your country.
Yeah, if you allow political Islam to grow, it creates isolation, and it's a one-way street. Singapore is an interesting kind of place. I lived there for a year and a half when I was at Nanyang Technological University. And yeah, Singapore has 4 identifiable racial groups. And by racial, we also mean religious, although always hard to say. But in Singapore, it's CMIO, Chinese, Malay, Indian. And of course, I was there. My identity card said, oh. So it's fun to go somewhere else and be the other.
Be the other for a change, yeah.
And just, I mean, strange little things happen. Like I was at the university for about 2 weeks, and one of them said, "Look, we're all going out for lunch. Come with us. Join the group, whatever." So I'm the only white guy in amongst a bunch of Indian and Chinese. We're all having lunch. Whatever. We get in. The waitress comes over, starts setting stuff up. Everybody gets a glass of water, except for me. I got a glass of water with ice in it.
Oh.
And the guy next to me, an Indian guy, and I kind of said, how come I got ice and you didn't? He goes, "You're white." People want ice in their water. And you just kind of like, okay. That's when all of a sudden you realize you're being treated differently because of your skin color. It's hilarious. I mean, you're getting ice in your water. How bad can this be?
Yeah.
But you do realize there is a whole series of cultural issues and stuff in the background that maybe a lot of other folks don't get. But what I did find fascinating about Singapore is when Singapore was formed in 1965, they had race riots, Chinese beating on the Indians beating on the Chinese and the Chinese beating on the Malay beating on whatever. It was bad. And then Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, said, the answer is brotherly love.
Yeah.
You're going to love your brother or I'm putting you in jail. It wasn't the most loving kind of approach. But he said, look, you can't run a country and have folks beating on each other all the time. So there I am in Singapore, 2006. And I started to notice it's kind of a weird country, but yet it's successful. So you get onto the subway and there's Chinese, Malay, Indian, and the odd white guy standing there, i.e. me. You go to a hawker center, like the big outdoor food courts, all the Chinese folks sitting here, all the Indian folks sitting there, all the Malay folks sitting there, a little bit of crossover, and then the white guy wandering around where he should sit. But they actually have got to a point now where nobody beats anybody up on the subway. Nobody kicks anybody out of the hawker center for sitting in the wrong place. Us dumb white folks can wander around and eat whatever we want. And all you get is a couple of funny looks. Right. That's about as bad as it gets. But what I did notice, and this is the funny part, is just when I was at Nanyang Tech one day, I saw a Chinese kid going by on his scooter. And of course, he's on his scooter. He's driving the scooter. He's got the cell phone up here and he's texting with his phone while he's driving and thinking, welcome to modern Singapore. Right. Here's this Chinese kid with his Indian girlfriend on the back of the bike. And I thought, there you go. Deal with that, Singapore. You have been so successful in getting the racism and the violence out of the society. I got a Chinese kid with his Indian girlfriend. Right. That'll make for an interesting dinner on Sunday or Saturday or whatever. Oh, yeah. But in Singapore now, they're actually struggling with this whole racial identity because you're CMIO. But now you've got a whole generation of youth who are intermarrying because the whole Chinese, Malay, Indian thing to them, they've been told it's not important. So they think it's not. Now, here's the counter example. In Yugoslavia, Tito did the same thing. In 1948, when the Civil War was over and it finally got quieted down, he said the same thing, brotherly love. There was a highway of brotherly love that ran from Zagreb to Belgrade. Tito said the same thing. Slovenians, Croatians, Bosnian Muslims, Serbs, Albanians, Macedonians, we're all going to love each other or I'll kill you.
Right.
Tito was quite clear. He killed people if you spoke out. But by the time the Civil War started again in 1990, the first people who suffered there were the mixed marriages. Because by the late 1980s, you had a generation growing up where Croat girls were marrying Serb boys were marrying Muslim girls were marrying Albanian guys or whatever. And only when the forces of nationalism were unleashed again, did that all of a sudden become a bad thing and you had to leave the country. So Singapore has been good in the sense for 30 to 40 years, they put a hardcore policy of no racism, no this, no that. And they've kept it. And now Singapore is successfully integrated. You can go anywhere in the city without worrying about it. Yugoslavia did it for 30 or 40 years and then backed off and it went right back to violence. So one of my reasons that I'm involved in this whole issue of extremism, radicalization, political Islam is I've seen the alternatives. And if we allow what's happening in Canada and the United States now to continue, we're going to get the same sort of problem. We have to teach people and say, I'm sorry, I don't care about your political Islamic beliefs from 632. here's how we run this country. This is what we're going to do. You can come here, you can do what you want to do, you can build your mosque, but no, we are not granting you special privileges. No, you don't get different rights from everybody else. Because as soon as Group A gets more rights than Group B, you get the politics of identity and you get violence, especially if the group advocating special privileges are not like the Mennonites or the Renanites or the, groups like that.
Right.
They're actually saying, you have to let us control your lifestyle. So yeah, that's kind of a big issue to me.
I think that's such a good point that you're making about, the country has to stay the course. You can't go on this course and then sort of back out, have be in two minds, halfway down the road, because the journey that Canada and the United States are on, it's still in the middle in terms of like creating that sort of a dynamic that exists in Singapore right now. So it's a horrible time to be backing away from that. And in sort of addition to that point as well, do you think that the Trudeau government right now, we see all the examples of how they sort of suck up to the more radical Islamic voices and the Khalistani voices. Is there any sort of a part within the Trudeau government that is willing to hear out the more progressive Muslim voices?
Actually, formally, the answer is no.
Okay.
Every time you see the Trudeau government saying, oh, we do Islamic community outreach, we're going to this mosque, that group. Trudeau had a meeting in Ottawa here last year with what he called, all the Muslim community leaders. Every one of them from an identifiable front group. Nobody from Progressive Muslim Voices, nobody from the Muslim Reform Movement. Rahil Reza from Muslims Facing Tomorrow wasn't there. Tahir Gora wasn't there. None of those folks who advocate modernist, humanist Islam, and more importantly, nobody who's like an ex-Muslim or whatever. Not at all. So it was quite instructive to see what he calls Muslim community leaders. The rest of us would call front group leaders.
Right.
It's that group or not. Now, just to be clear here, we're picking on the Liberal Party, and they should be picked on because they're doing a bunch of really bad things. Having said that, it's not a Liberal Party problem by itself. The NDP and the Conservatives have both gone down the same path. In fact, the NDP were targeted first by the radical Islamists to have an entryism problem. And then I think even they kind of looked around and said they're the third political party and they're never going to be in power, so whatever. So then they looked at the Liberals, and there is a natural, what we call green-red alliance, green for Islam, red for the sort of socialist, liberal kind of thing. So now they've gotten deep roots into the Liberal Party to a point now where we have junior cabinet ministers, members of parliament, this kind of thing, who clearly have an open Islamist agenda. But the same thing's going on in the Conservative Party. At the provincial level here in Ontario, we've seen it. They're trying to clean it up a bit. I'm not sure how successful. Same thing at the national level. There are more people starting to move into the Conservative Party who are hardcore Islamists. And when you go to them and say, now is the time to act, stop it before it's an issue, stop it before it becomes truly embarrassing at a national level. And they're like, well, we have to accommodate, we have to get the votes, we have to do this. And it's like they're buying the fodder that they're being fed by radical Islam, that you have to listen to them or they'll make sure you don't get the votes kind of a thing. And I'm sure it's true. The Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, just ran not on a really strong anti-political Islam kind of platform, but he's pretty clear that these aren't necessarily his favorite people. But nonetheless, he formed a majority government here in Ontario. So we're trying to tell people and say, no, look, most Muslims, and that's probably still 50, 60, 70%, don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't like Hizb ut-Tahrir. They don't like Al-Qaeda. They don't like, they especially don't like the Iranian theocratic system that's being run down the throat of the Shia. Given an alternative, they'd go in that direction. But that's sliding away now as more and more are kind of moving into the party. So we look at France, we look at Sweden, we look at Belgium and say, that's where we're going. And they won't take the lesson on board. You look at what's happening in America right now, where you've got a couple of Congress people who directly consort with and do fundraising for listed terrorist groups. And then they say there's nothing wrong with what I'm doing. And it's
I mean, you have someone, you're talking about Ilhan Omar is one of those people, and she openly shares the stage with that lady, Linda Sarsour, who's an open anti-Semite, speaks openly against, her thoughts about what should happen to Israel and the Jews in Israel. And it's incredible that something like that happens and you share a stage with somebody like that. And if people criticize you and if people say that, hey, why are you sharing a stage with such a person? If you're sharing a stage with such a person, you're indirectly endorsing her views. Immediately she'll come out and say, oh, well, you're just criticizing me because you hate Islam and you hate Muslims.
Yeah, what I thought really fascinating about her response to that, a few days later, she flew out, I think it was to California, for a fundraising dinner for CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. If you go to the Middle East, in like the United Arab Emirates within the Arab League, they've actually listed CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, as a terrorist group.
Wow.
And the United Arab Emirates, the folks that did up the list, said, we're very clear on this. Terrorist groups aren't just the guys with the bombs and the guns. They say the really dangerous people are the people with the checkbooks and the cultural centers. So they say it's not just the terrorist group that's dangerous. It is the proxy, it is the front group, and it is the fundraiser for those groups. So there's Congressman Omar under criticism for being seen to be too close to radical Islam. What does she do next? Listed terrorist group. And you're kind of like, she is sending you the message, and the message is, I don't care. This is what I'm doing, and I'm going to get away with it because you don't have the guts to oppose me. So dear old Nancy Pelosi there, I don't know if anybody noticed, but she actually was going to put forth some motion in Congress, sort of anti-Semitism is bad or whatever. And it was boilerplate stuff. It didn't say anything. Yeah. She lost the battle, and they had to make it, it's about Solomon Islanders and anti-Semites and everything. In other words, I sort of sat there and laughed, and I said, Hillary Clinton, Keith Ellison, Valerie Jarrett, Huma Abedin, all these people have so deeply allowed the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups to enter into the Democratic Party, they can now control certain parts of the agenda. And I sort of had to laugh at Nancy Pelosi going, she kind of had this look on her face when she's giving the this thing about their, anti-hatred motion or whatever they wound up calling it. And I sort of thought, it's that moment when you suddenly realize your party's been taken over by the Islamists and you can't control it. So it was kind of a bellwether moment that there is Omar, who is overtly supporting a listed terrorist group, openly wearing hijab, which is a sign of oppression, openly supporting radical Islam. And where she comes from, she says, well, I experienced it differently. It's like, yeah, Somalia is a bit different. I don't dispute that. But I mean, this woman literally knows what she's doing. She's not stupid. This is the racism of low expectations at play. You're trying to say, well, she doesn't really understand what's going on. It's like, yes, she does. Yeah. Smart. She is a smart woman. But there's the Democratic Party. When they tried to push back against her, they discovered they couldn't. Keith Ellison, who was the number 2 guy of the DNC, and he was almost the leader of the DNC, takes money from the Muslim American Society, which is also a listed terrorist group. He works with CARE USA, listed terrorist group. He speaks at ISNA, Muslim Brotherhood Front Group.
Wow.
I mean, it's that obvious for years that they've worked very hard at getting into the Democratic Party. They're there, same way they are in the Liberal Party now in Canada, same way you can see that Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party in the United Kingdom now looks like it's actually fracturing, where some people have left the party and said it's viciously anti-Semite and so viciously pro-political Islam, we just can't deal with it anymore. And now I see there was another meeting with 100 Labour MPs, I think it was yesterday, where they're talking about forming a separate group to get away from it. But, the problem is that deep in our societies. We watch France, we watch Belgium, and we still won't get the message. We still can't deal with the issue, and we still can't talk about it openly.
Yeah, it brings me to the question of sort of demographics a little bit as well, because the Muslim population in America is very small. And so with that tiny amount of, people, they're still able to influence the narrative and influence political decisions in such a major way. Now, in Canada, I don't know if the population proportions is the same way, but let's look at Europe, for example. In Europe, it's a lot higher, particularly in France, which has one of the highest proportion of Muslim population anywhere in Europe. Even in England, I don't believe it's that high, but it's still, it's big enough to be able to influence government policy and culture in a major way. So these are countries where A, the Muslim population isn't very high anyway, but is becoming higher, especially since they've taken more people, and B, the Muslim birth rates are quite high in European countries. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but there is a demographic pressure on these countries as well. And the demographic pressure that is coming on these countries is not necessarily coming from these, moderate Muslims that are integrating into these societies seamlessly, are, both the husband and wife are working and they don't really have time to raise 15 children, so they're having 1 or 2 children tops. It's the sort of other types of Muslims that are putting the population pressure. So if at this point in time, when their population levels are where they are, they're able to control the narrative and the political situation in such a way, what do you think happens in 10 years?
But like what you just asked is an interesting kind of political science question, whether you know it or not. Another question would be, what percentage of a population is required to change the nature and direction of a country?
Right.
So the answer, everybody goes, well, call me when it's 50% plus one, then I'll worry about it. Or when they can control the elections, call me. But the actual answer in political science is a little unclear, but it's somewhere around 3%.
Wow.
So you look at the Soviet revolution in 1917, the Russian Revolution. How many people in Russia at that time were real honest to God, dedicated, diehard Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, communists, if you want to use that term? How many people were actually there? And a very generous interpretation of party membership and participation, whatever, comes out somewhere around 2%.
Wow.
In fact, it's probably a lot less than that. If you look at how many people in Germany in during the burning of the German parliament and all that good stuff, how many folks were actually Nazis? And again, a very generous interpretation says that about 3% of the adult population of Germany was Nazi. And of that, well over half of them said they joined just to get a job, just to get whatever. Like the old communist system. You want to be a teacher and engineer, you have to join the Communist Party.
Right.
Join the Communist Party, get a job. Same thing with the Nazis. Probably about half of them joined not because they were real Nazis, but because they wanted to get a job. They wanted to be the mayor of this, the engineer of that. They wanted to, get a good job. So the actual answer to your question is, if you want to successfully change the narrative of a country, if you want to change the direction of the country, what do you need? You need a diehard, dedicated, active population of 1.5 or 2%, something like that. And then you need a pivoting moment. And by that, I mean you need a narrative of oppression or something like that. So right now, economic times are relatively good in France. It's a relative term, but nonetheless.
Right.
Economic times in America and Canada are relatively good compared to like 1932 or something like that. But if we get a significant economic downturn, which we will sometime in the next couple of years, next year, who knows, recessions come every 10 years or so and we're overdue for one. If we get a significant economic downturn in France, whatever, you're going to see that level of discontent that's right now below the table start to come above the table. And again, the number of people you need to infiltrate and directly change the nature of a country, 1%, 2%, 3%, depending on the circumstances and background. And the answer is, we're probably not quite there, because a good deal of the Muslim population, i.e. the 5 or 8% in France, are not that politically active. They don't really care all that much. But if you see a big outflow from Algeria, which is going to start because the Algerian government's collapsing right now, right. Nobody's paying attention, but it is. Or if you see continued waves of migration into countries like Germany, we're going to find those magic levels. And the magic levels are well below 10%, well below 5%. That's all you need. A politically active population of a single digit type is enough to change the overall narrative of a state.
Wow. Wow, that's incredible. So I know you said, all it takes is, and I think I agree with you when you say, all it would take in a volatile situation like this is like an economic downturn, and you would see that discontent sort of start to bubble above the surface where it is below the surface right now. What do you see in Canada? Do you feel like in the next election cycle, what sort of election process do you see? Do you see these kind of political Islamist movement becoming stronger, or do you see a pushback?
You see the pushback starting. It's decentralized. It doesn't have a standardized voice. It doesn't have a point of reference yet. It doesn't have its own political party kind of thing. But if you look around Canada, if you look around France, Belgium, United Kingdom right now, what you're seeing is an increasing amount of the population that looks in Canada at the Liberal Party and goes, wow, I don't like where those guys are going.
Right.
I look at the Conservative Party and go, And those guys aren't a lot different. And then they look at the NDP as a bunch of socialists and they go, yeah, nice guys, but no, we're not going with them. Forget it. In France, when you see this yellow vest movement, people are trying to blame that on the far right. But the reality is most of those people are small town workers. They're mostly the soft left. But what you're seeing in France is people look at Macron's party and they go, oh, what a gaggle of fools. They look at the old socialist party and went, these guys did nothing for us. They look at the other, I forget what it's called, the something movement, which is the right-wing party, and they go, those guys don't represent us. And so you've got this increasingly large segment of the population in what one might call G7, G8, G20 countries, whatever, where nobody, where large numbers of people are looking at the individual parties and say, I can't stand any of these clowns. So go back to America and look at how did Trump get elected? A lifelong New York Democrat ran for leader of the Republican Party and won it, and then won the presidency. It's like, there are so many people that don't trust the Democrats, don't like the route they're going, but they look at the old school Republicans, the sort of the Bush family and all that kind of folks and say, don't like those clowns either. What Trump had going for him, and what a lot of people miss, is whatever one thinks about Trump, he's not a DC insider.
Yeah.
You can accuse him of many things, usually correctly, but you cannot accuse that guy of being a DC insider. He represents something fundamentally different. And I think this is where we're going, is we're going to see a lot of countries becoming increasingly unstable, increasingly factious, increasingly unhappy. So if you're an opposition movement of some sort, an Islamist extremist, a Khalistani, or whatever, this is your time to get out there and push really hard, because you're pushing into chaos in a vacuum. It's always much easier to push into a situation which is soft rather than a position which is stable and hard. So, if I was to go over tomorrow and start working for some Islamists, giving them political advice, I'd say keep your powder dry and start moving in the next couple of years, because you're going to be pushing into very weak opposition. Now, in terms of the pushback against it, we still see that anybody who pushes back, the greatest problem they have is not from the Islamists, it's from the government coming down on them. Mainstream media coming down on you, your own government coming down on you. I'm sort of a strange character in the sense I'm a product of the state. I started as a young person in the military, wound up in the intelligence branch in the military and served overseas in an actual war, and was an arms control inspector in what we now call the former Soviet Union. I worked for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as an intelligence contractor. I worked for our cabinet office in the government. I'm a function of the state. My whole life has been about serving the state through security and intelligence processes. But I look at it now, and when I want to speak on these issues, the biggest resistance I meet is not from the Islamists, not from Khalistanis, whatever, but from our own government. And they're the ones I have to keep an eye on. And when I censor myself when I'm speaking, that's who I'm censoring myself against, is our own government. And if I even thought of something like that 10 years ago, I'd have thought I'm going insane. But the reality is now our governments have changed so radically that political correctness has become the absolute standard bearer for everything. Same thing in America, maybe to a little less degree, but nonetheless, that's the route you're going. Same route in the United Kingdom and Sweden. As soon as you speak out against any of this, the greatest amount of opposition you're going to get is from your own quote unquote free press and from your own government.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crazy. Before we go, I do want to quickly touch upon one of the recent podcasts I listened to of yours, where you were talking about how Trudeau's government is finding itself becoming closer with the Pakistani establishment and sort of moving away from the democratic Indian establishment. And I listened to it a little bit, and I find that a little bit worrying. But more than worrying, I find it very surprising that a government would knowingly align itself with a nation and an establishment that is being increasingly isolated on the planet. People are not buying the eyewash that Pakistan is selling to the world anymore. The American government, for example, is one. The Financial Action Task Force is another one that are saying that, we're going to have to blacklist Pakistan because it is involved in terror funding. European countries are sort of following suit from America. And then I heard this thing about the Trudeau government becoming closer with Pakistan, and I think, what's the reasoning behind it, or what's the sense behind it in any way?
Yeah, it's a fascinating problem. I mean, you may recall Trudeau visited India. January of 2018, and it was an unmitigated disaster. Look at it. clothing, who went on the trip. There was a terrorist on the trip with them. Atwal had actually shot an Indian cabinet minister while the guy was visiting in Canada. But yet, nonetheless, Atwal gets taken along with the official program. And there's another guy we'll talk more about later. There's another guy on that trip who's actually a real honest-to-God terrorist trained in Pakistan who was also on that trip as well. More on that later. We'll talk about it just yet. But anyway, nonetheless, the trip was a disaster from every imaginable point of view. And not least of that was virtually, I shouldn't say everybody, there was a large number of people who accompanied the prime minister on that trip who come from Sikh backgrounds. But it's not because they're Sikh, it's because they're Khalistani. And that was the issue, is a couple of those people Indian government officials had refused to meet with in years earlier, saying that these guys are strong supporters of Khalistan, and a couple of them are actually banned from entering India until they become Canadian cabinet ministers, and then they get into the country. Our defense minister, for instance. Now, so that's kind of one data point. The other data point is we have Ahmed Hussain, who's our Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, has said, you know, the leader of Pakistan is a great guy. We need to move closer to Pakistan. We need more national security agreements. We need more investment. We need more immigration from Pakistan. And you kind of look at it and go, what is the possible advantage of getting closer involved with the government of Pakistan as it increasingly, I mean, it's increasingly become an export of terrorism. It's becoming an export of extremism. Its economy sucks, not to put too fine a point on it. It's not like it's a major trading power. It's not like it's China where you can at least say, well, there's money.
Right.
Not even that excuse, because the Pakistan economy, I think in very round terms, the population of Pakistan is about 1/10 of that of India, plus or minus whatever. But the economy is actually probably more like a whole lot less than that.
Oh, yeah.
Pakistan's economy just doesn't function all that well. So where's the advantage? And the answer is that Pakistan has a very strong Islamist orientation. And the Pakistani ISI, their inter-service intelligence agency, and for folks who don't know, think of that as the CIA, but with no oversight. Like the CIA running America, and that's kind of where you're at. But I mean, the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence Agency is supporting the Khalistani movement in Canada, in America, and the United Kingdom. And it's like, why do we want to get deeper involved with these guys? Because while we're doing that, it's at the expense of getting deeper involved in India, where we have a larger immigrant population from India than we do Pakistan. India has a large economy, which is probably growing. India has a rough and ready, kind of fractious kind of democracy, but nonetheless, they can actually fire a leader now and again and bring a new guy in. So it's a functioning democracy. It's got problems, but it's at least trying to push and head in the right direction,
right,
or head in a sort of a modernization kind of direction. Whereas Pakistan seems to be doing everything it can to go to the other way against all of our national interests. So again, the question when you ask what's driving it, and I would say what's driving it is the Liberal Party's interest in supporting Khalistan kind of movements and the Liberal Party's interest in moving towards Islamist. Pakistan is a natural ally in that case. And like I said, our own immigration minister actually got up on TV and said, what a great election they had in Pakistan. And, you know,
my goodness.
Great guy, and people kind of went, yeah, the election's not actually over yet.
Like, and it's barely an election. How could you would call something like that an election when the army controls every facet of it?
This is the other thing. I mean, people look at it. Even the European, I forget the European Union now. There's OECD or somebody from Europe went down to monitor the elections, and even they described them as flawed.
Yeah.
For the Europeans is quite a statement. So yeah, it's a lot of people in Canada are kind of like, huh? Why would we do that at the expense of India? But nonetheless, that's where the ideology of the party is driving. So we'll see what happens this fall. We have a federal election coming up in the fall. Mr. Trudeau is in a lot of troubles on these kinds of issues.
Yeah.
Some corruption issues to do with SNC Lavalin, which is a major engineering firm. Seems they kind of got caught paying tens of millions of dollars to the government of Libya when it was run by Muammar Gaddafi and what's his name, Saadi Gaddafi, I think, the son. Right. Gaddafi. And we brought the son of Gaddafi here to Canada, and they bought hookers and blow for him using company money. So it's kind of like, oops.
I'd say.
Believe it or not, the government of Canada, the Liberal Party, was changing the law in Canada to accommodate SNC so they wouldn't have to face criminal charges for corruption. So that scandal is kind of coming out, and people are looking at it going, come on, it was like Muammar friggin' Gaddafi. It wasn't like we were doing business in Switzerland or, you know, somewhere else. But
yeah,
So anyway, we'll see what happens. But nonetheless, the Liberal Party still at this moment has a decent chance of getting a minority government if they don't blow themselves up entirely between now and then. But yeah, I think this election, everybody says, oh, the next election is the most important one. Everybody always says that. Yeah. But I think in this case, it's actually important for us. It's important for America. It's important for Europe to say which direction we go in these elections. And we have to actually say, no, we're going back to our values. We're going back to our Constitution. We're going back to the rule of law. If you like it, good. If you don't, hit the road.
What sort of support do you see for a movement towards those values among people where they're like, well, I feel like we're going a little bit too far here. We have values set up in this nation and a constitution set up in this nation for a reason. And I fear that we're straying a bit too far from those values.
If you look at social media, if you talk to people on the street, if you read small town newspapers, there's a huge number of people concerned with this. If you look at the national level parties, they're not effectively articulating it. So Prime Minister Trudeau has had like a real bad run of luck. The India trip was a disaster. Yeah. The Lavalin thing's been a disaster. The let's bring the ISIS fighters to Canada thing has been a disaster. Our open borders where people are literally walking to the country now uncontrolled is a disaster. But yet, the less he's still running at high 20s, low 30s in the poll, which would be enough to get a minority government. The problem, really, is the Conservative Party has not had the guts to come out and actually articulate a law and order, constitutional values kind of platform. And I think when somebody does, they're going to have a much better chance. But we're not quite there yet.
Are you telling me that Canada needs a Trump-like figure?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reason he was successful was he actually says, at the end of the day, let's make America great again. And what he means is like literally America first. And unfortunately, America first has a lot of historical baggage that goes with it, has real problems. But nonetheless, at a certain point, you have to say, if you're going to call yourself a sovereign country and you're going to have a government, you have to have a border.
Right.
That's one of the basic Westphalian, the theory of the state, not to go into political science here, but we are Westphalian states. It assumes the state has sovereignty, and it assumes the state controls the territory upon which it claims to exist. And that means a border and the ability to enforce that border. But yet we have the sort of Nancy Pelosi's of the world that say, oh, we should just open the border and let everyone in. Yeah. Then it's like, well, what do you need a government for then? Get. And by the way, don't worry about your standard of living. Don't worry about crime. Don't worry about all that stuff, because the people coming here are going to, oh yeah, what are they going to do? That's the issue. Who's attracted to that kind of country? Folks who want to work, folks who want to participate will go through a legal immigration process. Folks who want to come up for the free ride or for criminality are going to walk in if they can get away with it. So yeah, it's an issue. We have to start a sort of anti-globalization, anti-elitist kind of movement, because this is what this is. The globalists tell us, oh no, borders cause wars. And it's like, yeah, we've had wars throughout our entire history. We've only really had hardcore borders since the 1500s. So no, borders don't cause wars. But even if they do, the idea of, well, we'll just open the borders and get rid of wars, it's like, no, instead of having war between countries, you're going to have war between neighborhoods, which is the direction we're moving now. No-go zones, this kind of stuff. Like there's no-go zones in Delhi. There's no-go zones in the United Kingdom. There's no-go zones in America. There's no-go zones in Germany. And you cannot have a country where rule of law works in this neighborhood, but it doesn't work in that neighborhood, because that is the ultimate recipe for civil conflict.
Definitely.
Yeah. So either we start moving back towards a sovereign state system, or we just give up on the whole idea and say, right, anarchy is the way to go, and we'll just do what we do.
Right, absolutely. So finally, to tackle this situation, I feel like there's a multi-pronged approach needed, right? There's an approach needed on the government side, there's an approach needed on the society side, there's an approach needed sort of on the media side as well, where I also feel like with the media, it's interesting because the media is in a position, or at least the traditional media is in a position where it is, traditional media is dying out, and social media and media platforms based on social media are the ones that are taking over. And a lot of traditional media either didn't expect it, or even if they expected it, didn't pivot necessarily well. So in their fight against obscurity or irrelevance, traditional media is trying to just, I feel like at times, say the craziest thing possible. And in saying the craziest thing possible, it allows them to continue to be relevant. So I think there's going to be a major change that needs to come in the way media behaves as well. So what would be your recommendations as to how to deal effectively with this issue in Canada. And then, of course, that sort of translates, at least in some way, to the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the media. I think one of the reasons Trump drives the mainstream media insane is these things. He's got an iPhone. So he can get up in the morning and say whatever he wants. And it goes to something like 45 million people, which then gets retweeted to the planet. The mainstream media is angry because they are used to having the role of interpreting what the president says to the people. So you never actually heard what the president said directly most of the time, unless it was through the lens of a press conference or the lens of an interview.
Yes.
And even they can cut and paste to put whatever message they want. Well, now you've got these things. And of course, Trump has been one of the few people to recognize that alternative media works and he can drive them crazy. So that's one problem. The other problem is much of the mainstream media now has gone to narrative journalism. It's about telling the story.
Yes.
And they say the idea of truth and facts was never really true because there is no absolute truth, there is no absolute fact. It's a goal that can't be achieved. So let's just go with telling the story instead. And it's like, well, you know what? You're right. There is no absolute truth. There is very little in the way of absolute facts, but it's a goal you should strive for. But instead, it's about narrative journalism. It's about telling the story you want to tell.
Right.
And of course, they can't figure out now why people hate them. So the mainstream media, however defined, in the polls right now, it's running between like mid-teens to low 40s, depending what question you ask and where you ask it and how you ask the question. But if you ask a basic question, do you trust the mainstream media? The answer is a resounding no.
Wow.
Because if you look at something like CNN, CNBC, whatever, it's all hate all the time. We hate Trump, everything we can do to get Trump, whatever. Fox News, weirdly enough, is coming out to look like one of the more trusted outfits. And oh my God, that's Fox. Is one of the more. They're not exactly pure in all of this.
Right.
But what you're finding is people literally don't believe the mainstream media anymore, and that's dangerous.
Yes.
Because a democracy can only work if there is a marketplace of ideas, if people can discuss what's going on, if there is freedom of speech, if you can challenge the government on various policies, then you can have a democracy. If you don't have a functioning media, you don't have a functioning democracy. It's impossible. So this worries me greatly that the media, especially the large media corporations, have gone full bore progressive, full bore identity politics. And a lot of them now, I mean, even the New York Times, there are people in the New York Times say, well, we were never really the paper of record. What did that really mean? It's like, well, it used to mean that the New York Times had a staff of 70 people that were full-time fact checkers, and that's all they did. The number of people they have now, 0.
Wow.
And asked, why did you go from 70 to 0? They go, well, we put Google on everybody's desk. So, the internet is truth and we don't need fact checkers. And it's kind of like, wow, the growth of the internet actually means you needed those fact checkers even more than you in the past. But unfortunately, we haven't. So if I had, if I could do one thing tomorrow to better the world, it would be to force the media to go back to at least trying to achieve the goal of factual reporting. Because what we're seeing now more is just partisan media. It's pro-left, it's pro-right, it's pro-this, it's pro-that. The other thing, and I think it's the same problem, just seen from a slightly different angle, is political correctness. Political correctness is about shutting people down. Democracies thrive because they were the exchange, they were the marketplace of ideas. You could exchange ideas, you could compete. Some guy could stand up and say the craziest stuff, whether he's a Nazi or a communist or this or that. But as soon as they talk for a while, people will look at him and go, yeah, he's nuts. I don't want that. But now you're not allowed to challenge anything, because if you do, oh my God, you're a fascist or this or that or whatever. But it's like for the Islamists, people say we should ban them. And I say, no, we should allow them to be out there. We should allow them to speak. We should be allowed to speak to them. The media should ask them questions about their beliefs. So here in Canada, for instance, the CBC, which is increasingly becoming the state broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, funded by the Government of Canada, ran a series of vicious articles against the opposition leader, Andrew Scheer, because he's a self-avowed Christian. And in a certain way, I didn't have a problem with that, in the sense if some guy wants to be prime minister and he holds a certain set of values driven by whatever religion, faith, or ideology, perhaps people should be allowed to talk about that. So the CBC ran what I thought were pretty vicious articles on him, and they were attacking him, saying the problem with Christians is they want to tell other people what to do. Okay, fine. But we have people in the government right now who promote Sharia law, who are Islamists. And it's like, why don't you do an article on Iqra Khalid and ask her if Pakistani-based blasphemy laws driven by her belief in an Islamist system where she has openly supported Sharia, she openly supports Salafism, Why aren't we seeing the CBC sitting her down and saying, hey, let's look at your religious values and see how they work? Are you trying to tell Canadians how they can live? And if you can do that to Andrew Scheer, who's a Christian, why can't we do that to Ikra Khalid or Omar Al-Ghabr or any of these folks and just say, what is going on here? So yeah, political correctness to me is the single greatest threat to our society because it poisons the marketplace of ideas. You're not allowed to speak. And once that happens, then you go down, to me, a very dark path.
I agree. I think those are good ideas. I think it's very important in a democracy to be able to question ideas, to be able to speak up freely. And I completely agree with you when you say that even the Islamists should be allowed to speak, because that's how they get exposed. That's how people realize, all right, what they're saying is actually a whole bunch of nonsense. So you want people to hear that, and you want people to be able to make their own minds up. And I think free inquiry, free questioning, free speech is so important in a society, particularly a democratic society, that it really needs to be sacrosanct. It really needs to be defended. And things like, M103, when they're saying, oh, we're just trying to stop Islamophobia. No, you're just trying to shut down how people speak. You just try to stop people from speaking up, essentially. And I think that's a very important thing that I think all societies, irrespective of where they're based, need to ensure. So I completely agree with you there. And again, hey, I really want to make sure I thank you for taking the time out today and talking to me, Tom. I really do appreciate it.
No problem, Sham. Thanks for inviting me. Look forward to doing this again in the future. If you want on a whole bunch of other subjects we can go into.
Oh, 100%. I'm always open to it. I feel like as the elections draw closer for both the Canadian elections and the American elections, there's going to be a ton of more important topics to discuss as well. So I'd be happy to do it then as well. Guys, please make sure to go check out Tom's book. It's called Submission. I'll leave the link in the description of this video down below. Go make sure to check out the Quiggan report as well. I've been listening to it. I've found it very enjoyable. So please go ahead and check out that as well. I'll leave the link to that in the description as well. Tom, again, thank you very much for joining me today, and I look forward to doing this again soon.
Cheers, Sham. Been a pleasure.
All right, guys. We'll see you again for the next episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.